They did not open his file expecting a threat. They opened it expecting a formality, 31 years of employment records and medical scans and tax filings, a man old enough to be tired and ordinary enough to be approved without a second read. What they found instead was 3 years missing entirely, and a man who would not explain them. The Compliance Division called it a residency continuity review, which was the polite way of saying they were deciding whether Daniel Osei was allowed to keep his apartment, his work permit, and his seat on the Regional Logistics Council. The notice arrived in flawless English, because the hegemony had been reading humanities language for 11 years and had decided generously not to make anyone learn theirs. This review constitutes no accusation, the letter read. Only the routine confirmation that all persons granted continuity status possess a life history free of unexplained discontinuity. Underneath in smaller text was the actual sentence that mattered. 3 gaps flagged, years 4, 9, and 17, combined absence of 1,041 days. Beneath that, stamped in the header of every page, was a classification code the Compliance Division had invented specifically for cases like his. Trust Index, Provisional Category Pending Determination. It sounded clinical. In practice, it meant Daniel Osei was one bad afternoon away from losing everything he had spent 31 years building. A species that had never once needed to disappear for its own survival could not imagine a reason a person would. Officer Kell-Ren conducted the review in person, which was itself a courtesy, because Kell-Ren did not conduct reviews in person for anyone below Tier 3. He arrived smiling, a species that had spent 4 decades perfecting the human smile before ever landing, and it showed. The expression never reached anywhere near his eyes, and set a tablet on the table between them with the calm of someone who had already decided the outcome. "Mr. Osei," he said, "you understand that continuity is not a punishment. It is simply how we determine who can be trusted with infrastructure access." He tapped the tablet. 3 red gaps blinked on a 31-year timeline, tidy and accusing. "Where were you?" Daniel did not answer, not because he had something to hide, but because the honest answer took longer to explain than the meeting had been scheduled for. He had learned, over 3 decades of disaster response, that people who demanded an answer in under a minute were never going to listen to the real one. He said no and let the silence do the rest of the talking. Kell-Ren's smile did not move, but something behind it recalculated. "That is not an acceptable response, Mr. Osei. It's the one you're getting today." The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when someone in the room has decided the meeting is already over and everyone else has not caught up yet. The compliance aide beside Kell-Ren, a junior officer half his age, glanced at Daniel with something that was not quite respect but was adjacent to it. Because in 11 years of continuity reviews, nobody had ever simply said no. Daniel Osei had spent 31 years doing the least glamorous job in human civilization, making sure that when everything else fell apart, food and water and medicine still moved. No medals for it, no statues, nobody erects a monument to the truck that arrived on schedule. He had run supply corridors through 3 earthquakes, 1 war, and 1 communications blackout that lasted 412 days, and he had done all of it without a title anyone remembered afterward, because the people who remember the earthquake never remember who kept the trucks running. He did not need Kell-Ren's approval. He needed Kell-Ren to leave the room so he could get back to the actual crisis, which nobody at the Compliance Division had noticed yet, because bureaucracy is very good at reading files and very bad at reading maps. Colleagues who had worked with him for a decade knew him mostly as the man who never raised his voice in a crisis meeting. He had learned early that the people shouting loudest during a disaster were rarely the ones still useful by hour 6, and he had built an entire career on being useful past hour 6, past day 6, past whichever number made everyone else give up and call it a loss. His reframe when it came was quiet, delivered to the aide rather than to Kell-Ren, because Daniel had already decided who in the room was worth talking to. "You're auditing the wrong thing," he said. "Those gaps aren't what's wrong with me. They're the only part of my file that's useful to you right now." The Compliance Division did not believe him. Kell-Ren, in particular, found the response irregular enough to escalate rather than dismiss, because in 11 years of continuity reviews, irregular had always meant guilty, and guilty had always meant the file closed itself within a week. He assigned 3 analysts and a 14-day window, confident this would be the fastest closure of his career. It became, instead, the longest, and the investigation is where the file stopped being paperwork and started being a problem. Analyst Priya Nair pulled the year 4 gap first, because she was the most senior forensic auditor on the continuity team, and she liked starting with the easiest case. She had also, 3 years earlier, published a paper arguing that human disaster logistics data was too noisy to model reliably, a paper her own department had quietly stopped citing. She expected a medical absence or a criminal one. She found a seismic event in a coastal district of 190,000 people, communications down for 6 days, and a supply route that had been rebuilt from nothing by an unlisted coordinator whose radio call sign matched no employee record, because Daniel had not been an employee that week. He had been the only person in the district with a working truck and a working map. Nair stopped typing. She sat back from her console because her hands needed a moment before her mouth caught up. She pulled the casualty projections for the district, the ones that existed in official records, then pulled the actual recorded numbers, and the gap between the two was large enough that she checked her own math twice before she trusted it. He wasn't missing, she said. He was the only reason the missing numbers weren't higher. Analyst Matias Silva took Year 9, and Year 9 was worse, because Year 9 was a corridor through an active conflict zone, 340 kilometers of road that international logistics networks had marked unusable, moving medical freight past 2 front lines without a single documented military escort. Silva ran the route twice through his own modeling before he believed it, because the route should not have worked. He had once told a room full of colleagues that unescorted freight through a live conflict zone had a survival probability under 4%, a number he was now staring at with his own name attached to it. Daniel's convoys had run it 41 times. Silva went quiet for almost a full minute before he spoke again, scrolling back through 41 separate route logs, each one annotated in Daniel's own shorthand with the position of checkpoints that moved, bridges that had been quietly reinforced by local engineers nobody official had ever authorized, and a pattern of departure times that never repeated twice in the same week. He didn't beat the odds, he said. He rebuilt the road so the odds didn't apply anymore. Analyst Sana Okoye took Year 17 last, because Year 17 was the strangest, 412 days entirely off every grid that existed, human or otherwise, the exact length of what the history archives called the Long Silence, the communications blackout that followed humanity's first contact with a hostile scouting fleet. Nobody had clean records from that year. Okoye had assumed nobody ever would. What she found instead was a decentralized supply lattice built across 9 cities with no central hub, no single point that could be cut, no communications tower that could be jammed into silence, because Daniel had built it assuming every tower would eventually fail. It had survived 4 separate attempted blockades during the silence, and none of them had worked, because there had been nothing at the center to blockade. Okoye stared at the schematic for a long time before she understood what she was looking at. It was not a supply route. It was an entire logistics doctrine, unpublished, undocumented, invented by one man because the alternative was watching people starve while waiting for a network that no longer existed. She traced the lattice node by node, 9 cities and no headquarters, every route redundant against at least 2 others, every warehouse small enough that losing one meant losing almost nothing. And she understood, somewhere around the 400th node, that she was looking at a design most military logistics departments spent decades failing to reach on purpose. She brought it to Nair and Silva, and the 3 of them sat with the same realization, because the numbers only meant one thing once you put them side by side. Daniel Osei's gap years were not the parts of his life he had failed to account for. They were the only parts of his life that mattered, and he had never told anyone about them because nobody had ever asked the right question. The right question arrived 4 days later, and it did not come from the Compliance Division. It came from the Hegemony's own regional supply command, in a transmission stamped with an urgency classification the humans had not seen before. Because the interdiction fleet blockading a rival species colony chain had extended its patrol pattern into 3 systems that depended on human-adjacent freight corridors, and the Hegemony's centralized logistics architecture, elegant and enormous and built entirely around large hub stations, had no answer for a blockade that did not care about elegance. 4 stations sat inside the affected radius perimeter stations that had never once needed a contingency plan, because the main hub had never once failed in 3 centuries of service. And now the main hub was exactly the thing the blockade had identified and cut. 19 million civilians across 4 stations had 9 days of supply remaining. The Hegemony's own logistics command had run the numbers and found no route through, because every model they built assumed the same architecture that had failed them for 3 centuries. 1 hub, 1 set of approved carriers, 1 point of failure dressed up as efficiency. The ultimatum was not aimed at humanity. It was aimed at reality, and reality was not responding to threats. Kell-Ren read the crisis report and then read Sana Okoye's analysis, sitting on his desk unopened for 4 days because nobody senior enough had thought a decentralized lattice built by an unlicensed human coordinator was worth an afternoon of his attention. He read it twice. Then he did something he had not done in 11 years of continuity reviews. He picked up the tablet, walked back to Daniel Osei's building and knocked. Daniel did not accelerate because he was afraid of the deadline. He accelerated because 9 days was exactly the kind of number he had spent 31 years learning to beat. "You have a hub problem," he told Kell-Ren, not unkindly. "You built one system to move everything, and now the enemy only has to break one thing. I don't build systems that can be broken in one place." Kell-Ren, for the first time in the entire review, did not smile. The blockade run began the moment the deadline data went live. It did not look like a battle to anyone watching from the Compliance Division's monitoring floor. It was fought with freight manifests instead of weapons, and the manifests were the only weapon that mattered. 206 independent carriers launched across 9 separate departure points in under 6 hours, none of them coordinated through a central command. Each one carrying a fraction of the total load, each one authorized to reroute independently the instant a blockade ship appeared on sensors. The interdiction fleet had built its entire patrol doctrine around intercepting large convoys moving through predictable choke points, because that was how every other logistics network in the hegemony moved freight. It had 14 ships. It had never needed more, because nobody had ever given it 206 separate targets at once. It caught 14 carriers in the first 90 minutes, a real number, a number Daniel had accounted for before the first ship launched, because he had built the lattice assuming a fixed percentage of losses and rooted around that assumption from the beginning. The fleet commander adapted fast, splitting into smaller intercept groups within 2 hours, which was competent, which was exactly what a good tactician would do. It cost the lattice 9 more carriers. But splitting the fleet meant no single group had enough firepower to hold a choke point for long. And Daniel's rerouting algorithm, updated live from Okoi's console, began funneling carriers through the gaps the split created faster than the fleet could reconsolidate. One intercept group, outnumbered 9-1 by carriers it could not tell apart from decoys, broke off and retreated toward the edge of the system at the 8-kilometer mark. Well inside weapons range, well before it needed to. Nobody chased it. Daniel had built the lattice to move freight, not to win a war, and a fleet that had already lost the blockade wasn't worth the fuel it would cost to pursue. He gave the order to let it go before Okoi had even finished asking whether they should. Total runtime, 7 hours 41 minutes. Final tally, 183 of 206 carriers delivered. 19 million civilians resupplied with 6 hours of margin remaining. Every carrier lost had been insured, rerouted around, and accounted for before launch. Nobody on the ground ever knew how close the margin had been, because that was the entire point of building a system with no single number anyone could afford to watch. Kell-Ren's official transmission afterward was predictably immaculate, thanking the Regional Logistics Council for its contribution to hegemony-wide supply resilience, noting that the Compliance Division remained committed to continuity standards that protected the integrity of hegemony infrastructure, and using exactly 0 words that admitted anyone had been wrong about anything. It was released to 4 systems and read by 19 million people who now had food in their cabinets, because a man with 3 unexplained years on his file had refused to explain them to the one person who had no right to ask. The personal transmission arrived 9 hours later, unlisted, addressed to Daniel alone. It began with 9 full seconds of silence before Kell-Ren spoke, which was, for a species that had spent 4 decades perfecting the art of never being caught unprepared, the closest thing to an apology their culture had a shape for. "I read your file as evidence of concealment," he said. "That was audacious of me, because concealment was never what I was looking at. I was looking at the only competent answer to a problem my own division had refused to see coming. I am recommending your continuity status be reclassified. I am also recommending, separately, that the hegemony stop building supply networks that can be broken in one place." Daniel's reply, sent the next morning, was 3 lines long and contained no apology, because he had decided somewhere around hour 5 of the run that an apology was not what this was worth. He wanted the lattice kept active past the crisis, funded as permanent infrastructure rather than an emergency exception, and he wanted the 206 independent carriers, and every operator who had flown them, granted the same continuity status the Compliance Division had spent 4 days trying to take away from him. Kell-Ren approved all 3 lines within the hour, which Daniel noted without much surprise was the fastest the Compliance Division had ever moved on anything in 11 years. Daniel read Kell-Ren's approval once, then set it aside, because he was already 3 screens deep into Okoi's after-action data, mapping which of the surviving corridors could be made permanent before the next crisis arrived without warning. Nair asked him half-joking whether he felt any different now that the Compliance Division had spent 11 years never approving anything this fast and finally had. Daniel said he would think about it once he had finished the part of the job that actually mattered, and Nair noted, not for the first time that week, that his idea of the part that mattered never seemed to include anything that had already happened. He had spent 31 years being asked to explain the years nobody could account for. He had no intention of spending the 32nd explaining himself to anyone who had only just started asking the right question.